Mrs. Dalloway by Virginia Woolf. Chapter 1. Clarissa Dalloway. Mrs. Dalloway said she would buy the flowers herself. She thought what a fresh morning it was. She remembered Burton, the family home of her youth. The air had always been fresh and calm there. She used to look at the flowers, at the trees, and to talk with Peter Walsh. She used to watch them until Peter said, "Being well among the vegetables? I prefer men to plants." That was the most irritating thing. Peter always did it. He would be back from India one of these days, June or July. She thought his letters were very boring and lifeless. Now she remembered his eyes, some of his sayings, his pocket knife, his smile, and his bad-tempered mood. Clarissa felt positive and silent after she had lived in Westminster for over 20 years. While she was crossing Victoria Street, she thought about what people loved most about here. They loved life, walking, tramping, and cars, carriages, vans, and brass bands, the sound of aeroplanes. She loved life, London, this moment of June. It was the middle of June. The war was finished, but not yet for Mrs. Foxcroft or Lady Bexborough. They had lost their little ones. The King and Queen were at the palace now. It was June. The war was over. Life was going on in some way. Young girls and boys were taking their dogs for a run after they had danced all night. The roads were busy with motor cars, and the shops were full of nice jewelry. Clarissa, too, loved them. She was a part of it. She was going to give her party that very night. She entered the park. It was silent and peaceful. Then she saw her old friend, Hugh Whitbread, coming toward her. "Good morning to you, Clarissa," he said. "Where are you going?" Mrs. Dalloway said she loved walking in London. Hugh's wife Evelyn was ill again, and they were here to see doctors. Clarissa and Hugh had known each other as children, so she understood him quite well. Hugh always made her feel like a girl of 18. She felt very sisterly and close to Hugh, and of course he was coming to her party tonight, only a little late he might be. She always felt like a little schoolgirl beside Hugh, and she always liked him, though her husband Richard didn't. Also, Peter Walsh didn't like him, but Clarissa did. Hugh was not selfish. He did what others wanted him to do. Peter had said once, "He has no heart, no brain, nothing but the manners and ways of an English gentleman." Peter could be bad-tempered and impossible, but still Clarissa wanted to walk with Peter on a morning like this. It was such a long time since Peter and Clarissa were parted. She didn't like his letters. "If he were with me now, what would he say?" thought Clarissa. She remembered him now in the middle of St. James Park on a fine morning. But Peter didn't used to see the beauties around him. He was just interested in the state of the world. How he scolded her! How they argued! She had refused to marry him then, because she knew they both would be destroyed. For in a marriage there must be a little independence, freedom between people living together in the same house, which Richard gave her, and she gave him. But with Peter everything had to be shared, and it was impossible. Then she heard Peter had married a woman on the boat going to India. She never forgot that, and she lost her pity. Because he was quite happy, he assured her, perfectly happy, although he had never done a thing that they talked of. She thought his life was a failure. It made her angry still. Now she reached the park gates. She felt both young and old. She knew nothing, no language, no history. She hardly read a book now, and she would not say of Peter. She would not say of herself, "I am this, I am that." Her only gift was knowing people almost by instinct, by heart, by feelings. What was she trying to regain? She thought if she lived her life over again, everything would be different. She thought about her body. She didn't have dark skin or beautiful eyes like Lady Bexborough. Instead, she had a little funny face like a bird's. But she had nice hands and feet, and she dressed well. These were true. But now this body seemed nothing, nothing at all. She was old now and finished with having children. She remembered her old uncle's death. She felt herself unseen, unknown, empty. She was Mrs. Dalloway, not even Clarissa any more. Now she was going up Bond Street to the flower shop. She thought about her daughter Elizabeth and her tutor Miss Kilman. Mrs. Dalloway hated Miss Kilman because she would always make you feel small, guilty and unimportant. How poor she was, how rich you were, how she lived in such difficult conditions, how she had an unfortunate life. It was not Miss Kilman herself Clarissa hated, but the idea of her. She reached the shop and met Miss Pym. They together chose the flowers. The colors, this sweet smell, this beauty. She loved them. Chapter 2. Septimus, a sad young man. A loud noise was heard outside suddenly. "Dear, those motor cars," said Miss Pym. It was the noise of an expensive car. It stopped in front of a shop window. People tried to see the faces in it, but it was impossible. Nobody knew who they were. Was it the Queen or the Prime Minister? Among the crowd rumors were started, and among the crowd Septimus Warren Smith was there. He was a man about 30 with a pale face. One could see deep anxiety in his hazel eyes. Everyone looked at the motor car. Mrs. Dalloway, coming to the window with her arms full of sweet flowers, looked out with her little pink face. Septimus looked. He thought there was a great horror, ready to burst into flames. It terrified him. He felt all of this was because of him. He was in panic. He felt everyone looked and pointed at him. He was there on the street, standing up for a purpose. But for what purpose? He couldn't remember. "Let's go, Septimus," said his wife Lucrezia. "Come on." They got married 4 or 5 years ago. "I will kill myself," said Septimus. It was an awful thing to say, Lucrezia thought. She looked at the crowd. Did anyone hear him? Help! Help! She wanted to cry out to everyone, "Help!" She must take him away into some park. She had left Italy for Septimus's sake and had no friends in England. She held his arm, although it was without feeling, but he would give her, who was so simple, so lonely, and only 24, a piece of bone at least. It is probably the Queen, thought Mrs. Dalloway, coming out of the shop with her flowers. The car passed through. It took its way slowly and very silently. All the heads were turned the same way, to the window. Everybody stopped to see who it was, and now they looked at each other and thought of the dead, of the flag, of empire, of the Prince and Queen. A small crowd gathered at the gates of Buckingham Palace. They waited, looked at the palace itself. Little Mr. Bowley saw poor women waiting to see the Queen, nice little children, orphans, widows, the war. He had tears in his eyes. He raised his hat as the car went past, and he stood very upright. Suddenly, the sound of an airplane filled the ears of the crowd. There it was, coming over the trees with some white smoke behind it. It was making letters in the sky. Everyone looked up. With white smoke, the airplane wrote the letters upon the sky. But what letters? A? C? Was it an E? People tried to read it. As they looked, the whole world became perfectly silent. "It is toffee," said Mr. Bowley, and the car went in at the gates of the palace, and nobody looked at it. They were all busy with the smoke letters. The smoke faded away with white shapes of clouds. It was gone. It was behind the clouds. There was no sound. Then suddenly, like a train coming out of a tunnel, the airplane came out of the clouds again. It wrote one letter after another, with white smoke. Lucrezia Warren Smith was sitting by her husband in Regent's Park. She said, "Look, look, Septimus!" Dr. Holmes had told her to make her husband take an interest in things outside himself. Septimus looked up and thought, "They are signaling to me. It is a message to me." Tears filled his eyes. It was toffee. They were advertising toffee, people said to each other. Septimus was now talking to himself. He started violently. "Septimus!" said his wife. People would notice. Dr. Holmes had said there was nothing wrong with him. He was not ill. Holmes had told her to make Septimus notice real things, listen to music, play cricket, the very game for her husband. Septimus looked and did not see her, and it made everything terrible. Sky and tree, children playing, people walking around, all were terrible, and he would not kill himself, and she could tell no one. Septimus has been working too hard. That was all she could say to her own mother. She could tell it to no one. Septimus had fought in a war. He was brave then, but he was not Septimus now. He never noticed her. He was happy without her. But nothing could make her happy without him. Nothing. She remembered her sisters, her country full of lively people. Far was Italy and the white houses, and the room where her sisters sat making hats. She had left them for Septimus. She was all alone here. There was nobody. If she spoke, her words would fade away. "I am alone, I am alone," she said to herself, and cried. Septimus was talking to himself again. "Men must not cut down trees. There is a God. Change the world. No one dies from hatred." He waited. He listened. Sitting on the seat, he was writing down strange thoughts. He thought he heard birds singing in Greek. He heard messages about death and saw his friend Evans in the park. His dead friend Evans was there, he thought. "What are you saying?" said Lucrezia. "Away from people. They must get away from people," he said. "Look," said his wife. She was trying to make him see the real world around him. "Look," she repeated, for he must not talk aloud to himself. She never said that Septimus was mad, but she wanted to cry. Why hadn't she stayed at home? She cried. Chapter 3. What a surprise to see Peter again. Clarissa Dalloway arrived back home with her flowers. As the maid Lucy shut the door, the sound of her skirts made Mrs. Dalloway feel like a nun. A nun, she thought, leaves the world and all alone. Then she heard the cook whistling in the kitchen and the click of the typewriter. It was her life. She took the paper with the telephone message on it. Clarissa read the message. Lady Bruton would like to know if Mr. Dalloway will lunch with her today. Lucy said, "Mr. Dalloway told me to tell you he would lunch with Lady Bruton." "Dear," said Clarissa. She was disappointed. She was shocked with Lady Bruton asking Richard to lunch without her. Lady Bruton's lunch parties were said to be lively and enjoyable, yet she had not asked her to come? It was not jealousy, but she was afraid of time itself. How year by year she lost her youth. She was old now, and she didn't feel herself like a woman any more. She put the paper on the table and began to go slowly upstairs. She stopped by the open staircase window. She could hear the sounds coming from the street. She could hear the sound of life and see the flowering of day out of the window, out of her body and brain. Lady Bruton, whose lunch parties were said to be enjoyable, had not asked her. Mrs. Dalloway was standing there outside life. She felt old, alone, and without a heart. Like a nun, she went upstairs. There was an emptiness about the heart of life, the attic room. The sheets were clean and white, the bed was narrow. The candle was half burnt down because she had read at night. After her illness, her husband wanted her to sleep quite well, and really she wanted to read at night. He knew it. So her new room was an attic. She was lovely in girlhood. Suddenly there came a moment. She was in a cold spirit. She remembered her best friend Sally Seton and their friendship in the old days. Sally was different, unusual. Clarissa knew nothing about social problems. She didn't know the real life. So they would sit for hours, talking in her bedroom, talking about life. They liked to talk about how they would change the world. They wanted to find a place without private property. The ideas were Sally's, but Clarissa was just excited as she read Plato, Shelley. Sally's power was charming, her personality. She always shocked people. She was untidy and different. Sally would always make old Joseph tell her the names of the stars. He liked doing it very seriously, and she stood there. She listened. She heard the names of the stars. How she admired Sally! Clarissa thought Peter was always jealous of their friendship. Yet she thought of Peter, of their arguments. Yet how much she owed Peter Walsh. She wanted his good opinion so much, perhaps. She owed him words. What would he think, she asked herself, when he came back? Would he think that she was older now? It was true. Since her illness, she had been almost white. She looked into the mirror, saw her face. It was a little pink face of the woman who was to give a party that very night. Clarissa Dalloway's face. It was her face, never showing other sides of her, mistakes, jealousies, suspicions. Now where was her dress? She took her green dress, one of her most favorites. But she had torn it at a party. She had stepped on the skirt. Now she would wear it tonight at her own party after she mended it. She took it with her, scissors and needle. Then she went down into the drawing room. She sat down on the sofa with her dress over her knees. Lucy, the maid, asked if she could help her mend that dress, but Clarissa thanked her kindly. This was why the servants liked her. She was gentle, and she always thanked for their help. Now where was the tear? She was calm and happy while mending it. She thought of death. It would be like the whole world seems to be saying, "That is all." Even the heart and the body says too, "That is all. Fear no more." And the body alone listens to the life outside somewhere. "God, the front door bell!" cried Clarissa. She listened. "Mrs. Dalloway will see me. Yes, she will see me. Yes, yes, yes. After all these years in India, Clarissa will see me," said the elderly man, running upstairs. "Who can it be?" asked Mrs. Dalloway. She heard a hand upon the door. She tried to hide her dress. Now the door opened, and so surprised she was to see him again. Peter Walsh! She was so happy, so shy, so excited to see him again. "And how are you?" said Peter Walsh, taking both her hands and kissing them. She has grown older, he thought. I cannot tell her anything about it, he thought, for she has grown older. They sat down, and he took out a pocket knife. She is looking at me, he thought, and became shy. Exactly the same, Clarissa thought. The same look, the same suit, only a little thinner. He looks well, just the same, she said to herself. How nice it is to see you again, she cried. He had his knife out. That is so like him, she thought. He said he had only reached town last night. And how was everything? How was everybody? Richard? Elizabeth? Then he pointed at the green dress. What is all this? He asked. He is very well dressed, thought Clarissa, yet he always criticizes me. He saw her mending a dress and thought, all the years I have been in India she has been mending her dress, playing about, going to parties. He felt angry. For some women, he thought, marriage and having a husband like Richard are the worst things. I am mending my dress, for we have a party tonight, my dear Peter, said Clarissa. It was so nice to hear her say that, my dear Peter. It was delicious to hear her say that, my dear Peter. Really, it was all so delicious, the silver, the chairs, all so delicious. Then he said why she wouldn't ask him to her party. How charming he is now, Clarissa thought. She remembered the past. Why didn't she marry him that summer? They talked about their old days. Peter was never good friends with Clarissa's father then, but he never liked anyone who— Our friends, said Clarissa. She was about to say, who wanted to marry me, but she stopped. Peter wanted to marry her, but Clarissa's father was never kind to him. Peter remembered how it had broken his heart. I was more unhappy than I have ever been since, he thought. Why should she make him so unhappy? Why make him think of the old days again? Why? Do you remember the lake? She asked. Yes, said Peter. Yes, yes. But it made him upset. Stop, stop! He wanted to cry. Because he was not old. His life was not finished. Shall I tell her? He thought. He would like to make everything clear. But she is too cold, he thought. Daisy would look simple beside Clarissa, and she would think me a failure, in the Dalloway sense. I am a failure, he thought. When it is compared with all these things Richard has and gives Clarissa, I am a failure. He felt it. Playing with a knife, what an unusual thing, thought Clarissa. She felt unprotected. This visit made her quite upset. Well, and what has happened to you? She asked. So Peter and Clarissa were sitting side by side and questioning each other. He remembered his doings, his marriage, his job. Millions of things, he said. She was listening to him carefully. I am in love, said Peter. In love with a girl in India. In love, she said. At this age, how could it be? But she felt in her heart, he is in love. Jealousy made her cheeks with color, made her look very young, very pink. He was in love, not with her, with some younger woman, of course. And who is she? She asked. A married woman, the wife of a major in the Indian Army. She has 2 small children. I have come to see my lawyers about the divorce." "There they are," he thought. "Do what you like with them, Clarissa. There they are." Now Daisy and her 2 small children became more and more lovely as Clarissa looked at them, because nobody understood him, felt with him, as Clarissa did. The wife of the major in the Indian Army? 2 small children? What a waste! How silly! Clarissa thought. Peter has been a failure all his life. First he was sent down from Oxford University, then he married a girl on the boat to India, and now the wife of a major? Thank God that I didn't marry him, Clarissa thought. But still, she couldn't forget that her dear Peter, he was in love with someone else. Now his pocket-knife annoyed her. "Leave it alone," she cried to herself. "At this age, how silly." "I know all that," Peter thought. "I know what I am up against, Clarissa and the Dalloways, and all the rest of them, but I will show Clarissa." And then, most surprisingly, he couldn't control himself, and he burst into tears. He cried and cried. Clarissa took his hand, came nearer and kissed him. Then she left his hand and sat back. She felt so easy with him, so light-hearted. She thought, if I had married him, this happiness would have been mine all day. But it was finished for her now. The sheet was stretched, and the bed was narrow. She was now alone, left behind. She remembered Richard. He was lunching with Lady Bruton. "He has left me. I am all alone forever," she thought. Peter was now standing in front of the window. "Take me with you," she wanted to say to him. Then she felt like she and Peter had lived together in a play, and it was finished. The woman had to go now, get out of the play. Now it was time to move, and as a woman takes her things together, her cloak, her gloves, her opera glasses, and gets up to go out of the theater into the street, Clarissa got up and went to Peter by the window. How strange, Peter thought. She still had the power to make him feel as she did in her youth. "Tell me," he said, "are you happy, Clarissa? Does Richard—" The door opened. "Here is my Elizabeth," said Clarissa emotionally. Then the clock struck 11:30, and Peter, after saying hello to Elizabeth, went out quickly. He cried, "Goodbye, Clarissa!" without looking at her. He left the room, ran downstairs, and opened the hall door. "Peter, Peter!" cried Clarissa. "Remember my party tonight." Her voice was thin and very far as Peter Walsh shut the door. Chapter 4. Peter is an adventurer. "Remember my party," said Peter Walsh to himself. "Oh, these parties," he thought. "Clarissa's parties. Why does she give these parties?" Yet he didn't blame her. As he walked down the street, all of India stayed behind him. He, Peter Walsh, was now really in love for the first time in his life. Clarissa has become hard, he thought. The way she said, "Here is my Elizabeth," annoyed him. Why not, "Here is Elizabeth" only? It was not real, and Elizabeth didn't like it either. Because he understood young people, he liked them. There was always something cold in Clarissa, he thought. Then he got angry with himself because of being emotional. How he cried in front of her. He told her everything, as he always did. As the sun went behind a cloud, silence fell on London, and fell on the mind. Clarissa refused me, he thought. He stood there thinking, she didn't want me. The clock of St. Margaret's Church struck 11:30. I am not late, he thought. It is 11:30. The sound of St. Margaret said, like there is something alive. It is like Clarissa herself, he thought, with a deep emotion. Just like years ago, in their youth, they sat close to each other, and this sound of the clock had come into the room and then gone away, left them. But what room? What sound? And why had he been so unhappy while the clock was striking? He thought, Clarissa had been ill, and this sound was full of unhappiness. The last sound of the clock was for death. It was her heart, he remembered. That final stroke was for death. It was in the middle of life. Clarissa was falling where she stood, in her drawing room. "No, no," he cried. "Clarissa is not dead. I am not old," he cried. "She is not dead." He was anxious for her. He was not old. He didn't care about the Dalloways, the Whitebreads, and their sayings, though he sometimes would like to know if Richard couldn't help him to some job. He had been sent down from Oxford, it was true. He had been a socialist and a failure in a sense. It was true, too. But still he thought, the future is in the hands of young men such as he was 30 years ago. As he stepped down the street, he saw young soldiers in uniform with guns. On their faces, Peter saw love of England, duty and faithfulness. He thought one had to respect it. He could respect it in these boys. Nobody yet knew he was in London, except Clarissa, and the earth, after the voyage, still looked like an island to him. He was standing alone here, alive, unknown. What is it? Where am I? And why does one do it after all? He thought about Daisy's divorce. He looked at the streets, watched the endless roads under his feet. He was free for an hour or so. He would go where he would like. He thought, I haven't felt so young for years. He wanted to escape from being what he was. He felt like a child who ran out of doors. And there was a young woman who came, walking across the street. She became the very woman Peter had always had in mind, young, happy, plain, black but charming. He started after her to follow this woman. This excitement, he felt, called his name. Not Peter, but you. You, she said, only you, saying it with her white gloves and her shoulders. Her dress moved so kindly as she walked. But she is not married. She is young, very young, Peter thought. There was something perfect about her. She was not worldly, unlike Clarissa, not rich. She moved, she went on. He followed her, but other people got between them in the street. It was difficult to follow now, yet he went after her. There was color in her cheeks, mockery in her eyes. He was an adventurer. On and on she went, turned down one of the little streets. Her cloak, her gloves, her shoulders, her hair were calling him. It was now the great moment, for she stopped and opened her bag. She gave a look in Peter's direction, but not at him. It was a look saying, goodbye. She took out her key, opened the door, and went in. Clarissa's voice saying, remember my party, filled his ears. It was over now. Well, I have had my fun, I have had it, he thought. He turned, went up the street. He thought of a place to sit. Where should he go? No matter, for it was early, still very early. It was a beautiful morning, like a perfect heart. Life was alive through the streets. Peter watched everything around him. He saw London, the season, civilization. It was the moment of pride in England, civilization. There was Regent's Park. Yes, he remembered his childhood, perhaps because of seeing Clarissa. For women live much more in the past than we do, he thought. They attach themselves to places, and their fathers. A woman is always proud of her father. Burton was a nice, very nice place, but I could never get on with her father, he thought. He remembered an argument about something, perhaps politics. Yes, he remembered Regent's Park. He looked for an empty seat. An old gray woman was sitting there with a baby asleep. He went and sat down by that woman. He remembered Elizabeth as she came into the room and stood by her mother. She has grown big. She was beautiful, but not pretty. She cannot be more than 18. Perhaps she doesn't get on with Clarissa. I shall try and get a word alone with Elizabeth tonight, he thought. Suddenly he closed his eyes. All the sounds of trees, people, children, traffic passed across his mind, and down he fell into sleep. He saw strange visions in his dream. A lonely traveler is among the trees. He sees a big, very big figure in the trees. This man thinks he can never go back to the lamplight, to the sitting room, never finish his book, never smoke his cigarette. Then he comes to a door waiting for his return. A woman, perhaps a mother, was looking for a lost son. There are the mothers of sons killed in the wars of the world. Women and men wait for sons' death. They know it. Wait without fear. Chapter 5. Clarissa went away forever. He woke up suddenly, saying to himself, "The death of the soul." "God, God," he said to himself out loud, opening his eyes. The death of the soul. These words were from some room, some past. Now it became clearer. It was at Burton that summer when he was so in love with Clarissa. He remembered now. There were a great many people talking and sitting round a table after tea. The room was full of yellow light and cigarette smoke. They were talking about a man and his wife. He had married his housemaid. He was one of their neighbors. He and his wife had paid a visit which had been an awful one. She was dressed absurdly, and Clarissa never stopped talking about that woman and her ugly dress. She imitated her, and she went on and on. Then somebody said, "Sally Seton it was." Did it make any real difference to one's feelings to know that before they'd married she had had a baby? In those days it was a bold thing to say. Everybody was shocked. No one could say a word. Peter could see Clarissa there. She turned pink and said, "Oh, I shall never be able to speak to her again." It was very uncomfortable. Peter thought it was normal for girls like Clarissa, because she knew nothing, but her way of saying it annoyed Peter. She was cold, hard and closed. "The death of the soul, of her soul," said Peter to himself. Then Clarissa went off alone. Now Peter could see Sally Seton, like a child who has done a childish mistake, wanting to talk, but afraid. She was Clarissa's greatest friend, always there, an attractive girl, beautiful, dark, making bold speeches. Peter used to give her cigars, which she smoked in her bedroom. Clarissa's father disliked them both equally. As Clarissa opened the door to go out, her great shaggy dog ran towards her. She took it in her arms. It was as if she said to Peter, "I know you thought me absurd about that woman just now, but see how sympathetic I am. See how I love my dog." Peter felt she meant to say this. He knew Clarissa had something in her behaviors. They had always a strange power to understand each other without speaking. She always knew Peter would find mistakes in her doings, and Peter always knew she would defend herself, not in words, but by her actions. It was the way their arguments often began. Clarissa shut the door. Peter was terribly upset. It was all then meaningless to be in love with her, to quarrel with her, to walk around alone. It was a bad, very bad evening, he remembered. He couldn't see her, couldn't talk to her. There were always people about, and she would behave like nothing happened. That was the terrible part of her, this coldness, distance. He felt it again this morning while talking to her, but God knows he loved her. That night he didn't speak at dinner. He just sat there, eating. Later he could look at Clarissa for the first time. She was talking to a young man. Peter suddenly felt, she will marry that man. He didn't even know his name. It was that afternoon, that very afternoon, that Dalloway had come and Clarissa called him Wickham. That was the beginning of it all. She got his name wrong and introduced him to everybody as Wickham. At last he said, "My name is Dalloway." Sally got it, of course. She always made fun of him, calling, "My name is Dalloway." There was an ease in her way of talking to him. There was something gentle about her manners toward him. They were talking about politics. All through dinner he tried to hear what they were saying. After dinner, Clarissa came up like a real hostess and wanted to introduce him to someone. Spoke as if they had never met before. This way of speaking annoyed him. Yet even then he admired her for it. He admired her courage, her social instinct. He admired her power for making up things. The perfect hostess, he said to her. He meant her to feel it. He would have done anything to hurt her, after seeing her with Dalloway. So she left him, and he had a feeling that they were all coming together, laughing and talking behind his back. Peter thought she would marry Dalloway. He had never been so upset. People began going out of the room. They were going boating on the lake by moonlight. It was one of Sally's mad ideas. He could hear her describing the moon. They all went out. He was left alone. "Don't you want to go with them?" said Aunt Helena. And he turned around, and there was Clarissa again. She had come back to take him. "Come along, they're waiting," she said. He had never felt so happy in the whole of his life. Without a word, they made it up. They walked down to the lake. It was a perfect happiness. Her voice, her laugh, her dress. Yet he knew well that Dalloway was falling in love with her. She was falling in love with Dalloway. But it didn't matter. Nothing mattered. They sat on the ground and talked, he and Clarissa. They went in and out of each other's minds, without much talking. He said to himself, "She will marry that man." It was clear. Dalloway would marry Clarissa. He was not normal for himself. He wanted strange things from Clarissa. He asked impossible things. Sally wrote him all that summer long letters, how they had talked of him, how Clarissa had cried for him. The worst thing in his whole life happened at 3 o'clock in the afternoon on a very hot day. Sally at lunch said something about Dalloway, calling him, "My name is Dalloway." Clarissa suddenly colored and got angry. She said, "We have had enough of that silly joke. It's not funny." That was all, but for him it meant, "I am only playing with you, Peter. Richard Dalloway is the one for me." So he took it. He had not slept for nights. He sent a note to her by Sally. "Something very important has happened," he wrote at the end of the note. He wrote he wanted to see her very soon. There she came, even before the time, and they stood among the trees. She didn't move. "Tell me the truth, tell me the truth," he said. She didn't move. "Tell me the truth," he repeated. She was like iron, cold and hard. Then she said, "It's no use. This is the end." It was as if she had hit him in the face. He cried his eyes out. She turned. She left him. She went away. "Clarissa," he cried, "Clarissa!" But she never came back. It was finished. He went away that night. He never saw her again. Chapter 6. Septimus Cannot Feel. "It was awful," he cried. "Awful, awful!" Still, the sun was hot. Still, life was going on. He thought Regent's Park had changed very little since he was a boy. But Lucrezia Warren Smith was saying to herself, "It is bad. Why should I be so sad?" "No, I can't live like that," she was saying, while Septimus was talking to himself on a seat under the trees. He was not Septimus any longer. He was talking to a dead man. His words were bad and hard. She started to cry. She thought she didn't do anything wrong, for she had loved Septimus. She had been happy. She had left her beautiful home in Italy. She had left her sisters. But why? She came here to live in a different world. Why should she be exposed? Why not left in Milan? Why? She was feeling upset now. She must go back again to Septimus, she thought, as she was walking down the path. Because it was time for them to go to Dr. William Bradshaw. She must go back and tell him. He was there on a seat under the trees, talking to himself or to that dead man, Evans. She remembered Evans. She had seen him once for a moment in the shop. He had seemed a nice, quiet man. He was a great friend of Septimus's. He was killed in the war. But it would happen to everyone, she thought. Everyone has friends who were killed in the war. Everyone leaves some friends or things behind when they marry. For example, she had left her home, her sisters. She had come to live here, in this awful city. But Septimus didn't leave anything behind. He always thought about awful things. He became a stranger. He was not old Septimus any longer. He said people were talking behind the bedroom walls. He saw things too. An old woman's head. His dead friend Evans. Yet he could be happy if he wanted, she thought. One day, when they were standing by the river, he suddenly said, "Now we will kill ourselves." She felt he was going from her, and she caught him by the arm. But when they went home, he was perfectly calm. He would talk to her well. He would tell her how people were bad. He knew all their thoughts. "I know everything. I know the meaning of the world," he said. Then when they got back, he could hardly walk. He lay on the sofa and made her hold his hand to save him from falling down. Down, he cried into the flames, and he saw faces laughing at them, calling him horrible names from the walls, although they were alone. He began to talk aloud, answering the sounds he was hearing. He was arguing, laughing, crying, getting very excited, and he was making Lucrezia write some words down. The words were about death, about Miss Isabel Pole. She didn't want to write these silly things any more. She would go back. She was close to him now. She could see him looking at the sky, talking to himself and clasping his hands. What had happened? Why had he gone from her? Why did he always move away and show her hand? Take her hand. Look at it. He was sad then. Why? Was it because she wasn't wearing her wedding ring anymore? "My fingers have become thin," she said. "I have put it in my purse," she told him. He, then, left her hand. Their marriage was finished, he thought painfully. The relationship was cut. He was free. He, Septimus, the Lord of Men, should be free alone, for she left him. She didn't wear her wedding ring. He thought he was free now. He wanted to tell everyone on the earth the truth, the meaning of life. He asked aloud, "To whom am I going to tell first?" "To the Prime Minister," the voices said to him. "Yes," he said to himself, "I will tell the secret to the government first. I will tell them that trees are alive. There is no crime but love, only love." So deep they were, so difficult to speak out loud, but the world was entirely changed by them forever. "No crime but love," he repeated. Then he saw a dog. It was turning into a man. It was awful. He couldn't watch. Then it went away suddenly. He thought all the men would turn into some other shapes in the future. He knew that. He felt himself standing upon everything, on the top of the world. The earth was giving him a sense of excitement and pleasure beneath him. Red flowers grew through his feet. Music began against the rocks up here. Now he stepped into the snows, and roses, red roses, started to grow on his bedroom wall. The music stopped, but he himself stayed high on his rock like a sailor. But he felt he fell down. He was in the sea now. He thought he went under the water. He was talking to himself. "I have been dead, but I am now alive." He started to hear the sounds of life, so he felt himself running towards life. He felt the hot sun. He opened his eyes with fear and he looked. He saw Regent's Park. He heard the world say beauty. Wherever he looked, at the houses, at the trees, he saw beauty everywhere. It was the truth now. Beauty was everywhere. He sang. Evans answered from behind the tree. The dead were in London. Evans sang among the flowers. There they waited till the war was over, and now the dead, now Evans himself. He saw Evans behind the tree. The war was finished. Evans was dead. But now Evans himself was here. "For God's sake, don't come!" Septimus cried out, for he could not look upon the dead. A man was coming towards them among the trees. It was Evans, Septimus thought. "I must tell the world that Evans is here," he said. He stood up from his chair. "But I am so unhappy, Septimus," said Lucrezia. She wanted to make him sit down. "The time, Septimus," Lucrezia repeated. "What is the time?" He was talking. This man must notice him. He was looking at them. "I will tell you the time," said Septimus, very slowly, smiling at the dead man in the gray suit. The man came nearer and he looked at them. Septimus smiled at the dead man. "And that is being young," Peter Walsh thought as he walked past Septimus and his wife. He thought they were a newly married couple, and they were arguing. The poor girl looked so sad. Why should they do it to themselves on a fine summer morning, Peter thought. Peter thought how much everything has changed since he went to India. He had never seen London so charming, so civilized, so free, so rich before. After India, of course one would see everything perfect in London. One would fall in love with every woman one met. There was a freshness about them. There was design, art, everywhere. A change of some kind had surely taken place in England. What did the young people think about, he asked himself. Those 5 years, 1918 to 1923, had been very important, he thought. People looked different. Newspapers were different and quite open now. There were lots of young men and girls. They were just having a good time. No feelings hurt on either side. They were moving freely. Everything changed. Who was it now? Who had done that? Peter Walsh asked himself, turning into the Broad Walk Street. Who married a rich man and lived in a large house near Manchester? Somebody had written him a long letter about it. That made him think of the old days. Sally Seton, of course! It was Sally Seton. She was the best of all the friends of Clarissa. Sally Seton, the last person in the world one would have expected to marry a rich man and live in a large house near Manchester. The wild, the daring, the romantic Sally. She had never liked Hugh Whitereads. She had said, "Hugh thinks nothing but his own appearance." He remembered an argument between Sally and Hugh. Hugh, the perfect gentleman. How poor he was against Sally. He has read nothing, thought nothing, felt nothing. He just tried to make others happy, she had said. There is no life in Hugh. No country but England could have produced him. She was very angry with him for some reason. Something had happened. Peter forgot what, in the smoking room. He had insulted her. Kissed her? Hard to believe. Nobody would think of a word against Hugh, of course. Who could? Kissing Sally in the smoking room. But Hugh found his job and married Evelyn, thought Peter. They have had a rich life, and now I am here to ask them to put me into some job, he said to himself. For he was thinking of marrying Daisy. He would ask Dalloway or Whitbread for a job. It would be easier with Dalloway, he thought. Suddenly his thoughts turned to Clarissa. He and Sally used to talk about Clarissa. Sally had always said to him, "Take Clarissa away from here, save her from the Whitbreads and the Dalloways and all the other perfect gentlemen, for they would spoil her soul and make her more worldly." But Clarissa always had an open heart. She was perfectly aware of what she wanted. Her emotions were all on the surface. Beneath, she had a better judge of character than Sally, for instance, purely feminine. That woman's gift. She had a good character. Wherever she went, she made that place her own. In a room, although there would be a lot of people around her, one would remember only Clarissa later. It was not because she was beautiful or clever. It was just because she was there. "No, I am not in love with her any more," he said to himself. "After 30 years, I just remember her and our old days." It was thinking of her, criticizing her, trying to explain her. The one thing to say of her was that she was worldly. She cared too much for society and getting on in the world. "I hate failure," she had said once. Failure like me, Peter thought. One must do something, achieve something, like Richard Dalloway. As a part of a marriage, she goes to and gives parties, leaves cards, buys little presents, he thought. But she does it because she likes this kind of life. It was her natural instinct, he said to himself. She thought there were no gods after her sister. Sylvia had been killed by a falling tree. It was all before Clarissa's eyes. Later, she wasn't so positive, but it was her nature to enjoy life. Only she needed people, always people, to bring it out. And Elizabeth, Clarissa's dear Elizabeth, she was at a high school, and now she was within the society as a young woman. Peter thought she laughed at her mother's friends. Becoming old was this, he said to himself, as he walked out of Regent's Park. At the age of 53, one doesn't need people any more. Life itself, every moment of it, now in the sun, in Regent's Park, is enough, Peter thought. It was impossible for him to be so much upset as Clarissa had made him before. For hours and days he never thought of Daisy. Could it be that he was in love with Clarissa, he thought, remembering the torture, the extraordinary passion of those days. It was a different thing altogether, a much better thing, the truth being, because she was in love with him. He felt an extraordinary relief, wanted nothing so much as to be alone. Everyone, if they were honest, would say the same thing. One doesn't want people after 50. One doesn't want to go on telling women they are pretty. That's what most men of 50 would say, Peter Walsh thought, if they were honest. He thought of his visit to Clarissa, how he started to cry suddenly this morning. What was that all about? What did Clarissa think of him? Did she think he is silly? Not for the first time, of course. It was jealousy, he thought. But he was not jealous of Daisy. When she wanted to hurt him by writing in her last letter that she had been meeting Major Ord. She said it on purpose, he knew, said it to make him jealous. But it made no difference. He was only angry with her. Yet it was different with Clarissa. But what made him unhappy about Clarissa was that she was so cold, so calm. Women don't know what passion is, he thought. They don't know the meaning of it to men. She was as cold as ice. Suddenly a sound filled his ears as he was walking down the street. The sound was telling an old love story. The song was about a dead man and his lover was an old woman. She was so poor in her dress, and she was singing her song. "Look in my eyes with your sweet eyes, give me your hand again." She was singing how she and her lover used to walk in hot summer days years and years ago. Peter Walsh gave her a coin as he stepped into his taxi. She smiled and put it in her pocket. "Poor old woman," said Lucrezia Warren-Smith. "Where does she sleep if it rains? And does it have a meaning for people?" She was so unhappy for weeks and weeks now. She wanted to stop people in the street if they looked good, kind people, just to say to them, "I am unhappy." But this old woman singing in the street and people seeing her and walking on their way, all of this made her suddenly feel that everything was going to be all right. They were going to Sir William Bradshaw, she thought. His name was nice. He would make Septimus well again, she thought. It was a silly dream to be unhappy. Mr. and Mrs. Septimus Warren-Smith were walking more slowly than other people, but wasn't it natural for a man like Septimus? The young man carrying the greatest message in the world. He was the happiest man in the world, and the most unhappy. His hands were educated, his eyes were large and hazel, his face was intelligent and nice. Yet he had lived such things that changed him. He left home when he was a boy. He wanted to be a poet, and he could see no future in Stroud. He went to London and left a note behind him. His life in London changed him. He became hard. Then he fell in love with Miss Isabel Pole. She was one of his teachers giving lessons on Shakespeare. She gave him books and helped him write. He wrote poems to her. He dreamt of her. She corrected his poems in red ink without thinking of their subject. He saw her one summer evening, walking in a green dress. He was trying to write something, and at 3 o'clock in the morning he was running out, walking in the streets, visiting churches, and reading Shakespeare, Darwin, the history of civilization. Something was finished, Mr. Brewer knew. He was Septimus's manager at the clerk agency. He always thought Septimus was an intelligent boy, and he would, in 10 or 15 years, become a good businessman. He told Septimus to keep his health, for he looked weakly. He advised football, invited him to supper. He offered him a rise of salary when something happened. It was the European War, taking Septimus away. Septimus wanted to join the army. He went to France to fight for an England where Shakespeare had written his plays, and Miss Isabel Pole was walking in her green dress. He was a man now, an important man. He developed manliness. He drew attention. Septimus and his friend, Evans, were always together. It was such a great relation between them. But when Evans was killed in the war, Septimus felt very little. He knew it was the end of a friendship. The war had taught him much. He fought in war, lost his friend, saw death, got a promotion, yet he was still alive and under 30. When peace came, he was in Milan. He saw the sisters making hats. There was the younger sister Lucrezia. He saw her there, in Milan, and everything was finished. His friend Evans was put into his grave, and the war was over. But he had a sudden sense of fear in the evenings. He could not feel any more. When he opened the door, he could see the sisters, hear them, but something failed him. He couldn't feel. He was feeling only safe, calm there, but he couldn't sit there all night. There were moments of waking in the early morning. The bed was falling. He was falling. He asked Lucrezia to marry him when the panic was on him, that he could not feel. In a tea shop they used to sit, but even taste had no meaning for him. He put down his cup on the little table and looked at the people outside. They all seemed happy in the middle of the street, shouting, laughing, but he could not taste. He could not feel. A sudden fear came over him. He could not feel. He could read, he could think, he could calculate well. His brain was perfect. It must be the fault of the world, then, that he could not feel. The English are so silent, Lucrezia said. She liked it, she said. She wanted to see London, the English horses, the dresses, the shops. It can be possible, Septimus thought. It can be possible that the world itself has no meaning. He thought this when he was looking at England from the train window. They left Italy and came to London. At the office, Mr. Brewer gave him a good job. They were proud of him. "You have done your duty in war. Now we will do ours," Mr. Brewer said. Here he opened Shakespeare again. Septimus thought how Shakespeare disliked humanity. He saw the message hidden in the beauty of words. This secret message was hate and hopelessness. Dante had given the same secret message in his books, he thought. There Lucrezia sat at the table making hats. She was sad and pale, like a white flower under water, Septimus thought. The English are so serious, Lucrezia would say, putting her arms around him, her cheeks against his. They went to the museums together. They stood in the crowd to see the king. And there were the shops, hat shops, dress shops, shops with bags in the window. She would stand looking. Lucrezia wanted to have children. But she must have a boy. She must have a son like Septimus, she thought. But nobody could be like Septimus. So gentle, so intelligent, so serious. Could she not read Shakespeare too? Was Shakespeare a difficult writer, she asked. One cannot bring children into a world like this. Lucrezia told him that she could not grow old and have no children. She was very lonely. She was very unhappy. She cried for the first time since they were married. He heard her crying far away. He thought it was like the sound of a gun, but he felt nothing. His wife was crying, and he felt nothing. She cried hopelessly. His head fell on his hands. Now other people must help him. He gave in. Lucrezia put him to bed and called Dr. Holmes. He examined him and said there was nothing wrong with Septimus. What a kind man, what a good man, thought Lucrezia. Nothing made him feel. He didn't feel anything, even when his friend Evans was killed. This was the worst. Septimus thought how he had married his wife without loving her, how he had lied to her. Dr. Holmes came again. He examined Septimus's headaches, sleeplessness, fears, dreams, and the doctor said it was nothing more. Health is in our own control, he said. Have different interests outside, take up some hobby. When the silly doctor came again, Septimus didn't want to see him. But Dr. Holmes entered his room and said to him, Talking of killing yourself? Don't give such fears to your nice wife. Don't you have a duty to your wife? He should get out of bed, he said, because there was nothing wrong with him. Dr. Holmes came nearly every day. Septimus didn't like him, and he thought his only chance was to run away from Holmes. Without letting Holmes know, to Italy, anywhere, away from Dr. Holmes. But Lucrezia could not understand him. Dr. Holmes was such a kind man. He was so interested in Septimus. He only wanted to help them, he said. Septimus felt lonely. He heard the whole world was saying, Kill yourself for our sakes. But why should he kill himself for their sake? Food was pleasant, the sun hot, and this killing oneself. How can he kill himself? With a knife or gun? It is too ugly with floods of blood. He was alone like a man who was about to die. One day Septimus heard a voice speaking from behind the walls. It was Evans. The dead man was with him. Evans, Evans, he cried. And Lucrezia came in, with her flowers, and put them in a vase. She said aloud, These flowers are almost dead. I bought them from a poor man in the street. So there was a man outside. It should be Evans. Evans gave these dead flowers, Septimus said loudly. What are you saying, Septimus? Lucrezia asked, for he was talking to himself. She called Dr. Holmes. He's mad. He doesn't know me even, she said. You brute, cried Septimus when he saw Dr. Holmes. He gave him something to make him sleep and said, If you are rich and you don't believe me, you can find another doctor. He was not kind this time. Chapter 7. One Cannot Say I Love You. The clock struck 12 as Clarissa Dalloway put her green dress on her bed and the Warren Smiths walked down the Harley Street. 12 was the hour of their appointment. They were going to Sir William Bradshaw's house. There was a great grey car in front of the house. It was the car in which Lady Bradshaw used to wait for her husband. She sometimes thought of his patience and of the wall of money. This wall grew higher and higher between them, she felt. They had too little time to spend together, but she would say nothing, because her husband earned a great amount of money every time she waited for him in the car. Sir William himself was no longer young. He had worked very hard and loved his job. He spoke well and looked heavy with his grey hair. He could see the first moment his patients came into the room. He could understand the illness immediately. Septimus and Lucrezia walked into the room. The doctor saw Septimus in a great breakdown. He saw he was really ill. How long was Dr. Holmes his doctor? Sir William asked. 6 weeks. Said there was nothing the matter? Ah, yes, those general practitioners. Dr. William asked him, "You served well in the war." Septimus repeated the word war. "The war?" he asked. "The European war." He really forgot. In the war itself he had failed. "Yes," said Lucrezia. "He was given a higher job even." "They loved you at the office. You don't need to worry about the money?" said Sir William. He had committed a crime and been condemned to death by human nature. Septimus wanted to tell about his crime, and he said, I have committed a crime." "He has done nothing wrong. No, no," said Lucrezia. Dr. William wanted to speak to Lucrezia alone. They went out of the room, and he said, "Your husband is very ill. Did he talk about killing himself?" "Yes," said Lucrezia. "But he didn't really want to do it. Of course not." "He should stay in bed for a long, very long time, a long rest in bed," said Sir William. There was a good home down in the country. There he would rest and get well. Her husband would be perfectly looked after. "Away from her?" she asked. But he didn't like doctors. He wouldn't want to go there. He had to go, said Dr. William. He would get well there. When the people we love most are ill, we are not good for them. But he was not mad, was he? Sir William said he never spoke of madness. He shortly and kindly explained her the state of Septimus's case. He had talked about killing himself. There was no other choice. He would lie in bed in a beautiful house in the country. The nurses were kind. Sir William would visit him once a week. If Mrs. Warren Smith was quite sure she had no more questions to ask, they would return to her husband. She had nothing more to ask, not of Sir William. They came back to the room. Septimus was sitting on a chair, talking to himself. "We have had our little talk," said Sir William. Lucrezia said to her husband, "He says you are very ill." "You should go into a home," said Sir William. Septimus didn't like this idea of home. "One of Holmes's homes?" said Septimus. There was an unpleasant impression on his face. "One of my homes, Mr. Warren Smith, where we will teach you to rest," said Sir William. And there was just one thing more. He was quite sure that when Mr. Warren Smith was well, he was the last man in the world to frighten his wife, but he had talked of killing himself. "Everyone can be ill like you, but you have to rest in bed," said Sir William. "If you fall," thought Septimus, "then doctors try to close you somewhere." "Once you fall," Septimus repeated to himself, "human nature is on you. Holmes and Bradshaw are on you. Nobody lives for himself alone. You have a wife and a good job. You have a good future before you," said the doctor. "If I told the truth, if I told them about my crime, would they, Holmes and Bradshaw, let me go then?" thought Septimus. What was his crime? He could not remember it. He wanted to say, but he couldn't. Love, trees, there is no crime. What was his message? "Don't think about yourself. It would do no good to you," said the doctor. Was there anything else they wished to ask him? "I would call you Mrs. Smith and tell you what to do about it between 5 and 6 this evening. Trust me," he said. Sir William never used the word mad for Septimus, but he said Septimus was not in a sense of harmony. He had to be in order again, he said. Lucrezia had never felt such unhappiness in her life. She had asked for help, but Dr. William had failed them. He was not a nice man, she thought. As they walked out of the house, Septimus thought it would be very expensive for Sir William to have such a nice car. Lucrezia was very upset. Dr. William gave only 45 minutes to his patients and understood what their problem was: disorder. He tried to finish their illness by making them rest in bed without friends, without books, without messages, 6 months' rest. They just ate and slept. He forced everybody to do what he wanted. He wanted everything to be orderly. He wanted to keep everything in control. He offered help, but he wanted to have power only. If he failed to make them well again, he put them in a house, in control. And he was a good doctor, and he got his money. Lucrezia Warren Smith cried that she did not like that man as they were walking down Harley Street. Hugh Whitbread was looking at socks in a shop window. He had had a good life. He knew important people, like prime ministers, but he didn't go deeply. It was his habit. He always dealt with surfaces. He wrote letters to newspapers, set up charities, dealt with social problems, and he was always kind toward others. Richard Dalloway and Hugh Whitbread met on the doorstep of Lady Bruton's house. Lady Bruton herself preferred Richard Dalloway, of course. He was made of much finer material, but she wouldn't let them run down her poor dear Hugh. She could never forget his kindness. He had been really kind. As they entered, she said there was nobody else coming. They sat at the table for lunch. Everything on the table was so fine and colorful. Lady Bruton was the General's great-granddaughter, and she was very much like her great-grandfather. Richard Dalloway had the greatest respect for her. He knew her country and her people. He felt she was a great lady. "How is Clarissa?" she asked. Clarissa always said that Lady Bruton did not like her. Lady Bruton was more interested in politics than people. She was talking like a man, and her lunch parties were always for men. She thought women prevented their husbands from dealing with important affairs, such as politics or business. "I met Clarissa in the park this morning," said Hugh Whitbread. "Do you know who is in town?" said Lady Bruton. "Our old friend Peter Walsh." They all smiled. Peter Walsh? They remembered the same thing, how he had been in love and how Clarissa had refused him. Richard Dalloway had a very great liking for the dear old Peter. That was a strange feeling for Mr. Dalloway. He suddenly thought he would go back directly after lunch and find Clarissa, and he would tell her that he loved her. Yes, he would say that. "Yes, Peter Walsh has come back," said Lady Bruton. He had come back to their peaceful England, but it was impossible to help him. There was something wrong in Peter's character. He was in trouble with a woman, said Lady Bruton. They had all thought that was the problem with him. "However," said she, "we shall hear the whole story from Peter himself." They were waiting for Hugh to finish his lunch so that they could drink their coffee, but Hugh was very slow. He was getting fat, Lady Bruton thought. Lady Bruton thought of writing a letter to the newspaper The Times, but she always believed that men are better than women when it is about writing things. They are more orderly, and they know how to put things, she thought. She asked Hugh and Richard to write this letter for her. So Richard advised, and Hugh put it into words. Hugh began to write, but he was slow. After they finished the letter, Lady Bruton felt it was a great work. Could her own letter be like that? No, of course not. What she would do if Richard and Hugh did not help her. Thank God she had them. Hugh said he was not sure that they would put it in the newspaper, but he would be meeting somebody at lunch for it. Richard stood up and went to the picture on the wall. It was Lady Bruton's family. She was very proud of her family, and Richard always had an intention to write a history of Lady Bruton's family. Richard turned to Lady Bruton with his hat in his hand and said, "We shall see you at our party tonight?" She might come or she might not come. Clarissa had wonderful energy. Parties terrified Lady Bruton, but then she was getting old. After the two men left her house, she went upstairs and lay on the sofa. She felt she had a great power. Then she fell in asleep. Richard and Hugh stopped in front of a shop window. They didn't talk, they only looked in at the window. Hugh saw a Spanish necklace and thought his wife, Evelyn, might like it. Richard could not think or move. Hugh was going into the shop. "Right you are," said Richard. He went into the shop after him. God knows he didn't want to go buying necklaces with Hugh. Hugh started to talk with the shop assistant. All of this seemed to be strange to Richard Dalloway, for he never gave Clarissa presents except a bracelet. It was 3 years ago that he brought her a bracelet, but it was not a success. She never wore it, and it made Richard very upset now. His wife Clarissa! Peter had loved her very much. Richard thought of their life, Clarissa and himself. He wanted to buy a present for her. He drew the tray of old jewels toward him, and taking up first this brooch, then that ring. "How much is that?" he asked, but he was not sure about the one he chose. He wanted to open the drawing-room door and come in holding out something, a present for Clarissa. Only what? Richard Dalloway could not stand more than an hour of Hugh's society, and he said good-bye to Hugh, then left the shop. He would go straight to Clarissa and say, "I love you." But he wanted to come in holding something. Flowers? Yes, flowers. Because he didn't trust his taste in gold, any number of flowers, roses, orchids, to celebrate the feeling about Clarissa when they spoke of Peter Walsh at lunch this afternoon. He bought her flowers and thought of the feeling he had when they talked about Peter Walsh at lunch. Clarissa and Richard never spoke of Peter Walsh. The time comes when it cannot be said. One is too shy to say it, he thought. I love you. Why not? Really, it was a miracle. After the war, despite all difficulties, they were married. They had a life together. He was going home to tell Clarissa that he loved her. Clarissa was his wife, and it was a miracle, he thought. All the things around him, the people, the traffic, looked unimportant, gray and dull, because he was walking across the park to tell his wife that he loved her. It was 3 o'clock now. He had been jealous of Peter Walsh, jealous of him and Clarissa, but she had often said to him that she had been right not to marry Peter. Clarissa was right about this, he thought, and he would tell her that he loved her. Happiness is this, he thought. He came home and found her at her writing table. She was angry with a letter from Mrs. Marsham, and there was Elizabeth spending all this time with Miss Kilman. Prayer at this hour with that woman, Clarissa thought. Then suddenly she saw Richard with flowers at the door. What a surprise! She had failed him once, and Lady Bruton had not asked her to come to her lunch party, she remembered. But how lovely, she said, and took the flowers. She understood without his speaking, his Clarissa. How nice they are, she said. And how was the lunch party, she asked. Peter Walsh was back. Mrs. Marsham had written a letter. Must she invite her to the party? That woman Kilman was upstairs. But let us sit down for 5 minutes, said Richard. They talked about the things they did all afternoon. Peter Walsh, Lady Bruton's lunch party, preparations of Clarissa's party, and so on. But he didn't tell her he loved her. He held her hand. Happiness is this, he thought. They wrote a letter to the Times and talked about Peter, Richard said. Yes, and just as he always was, you know, said Clarissa. Peter hadn't changed. And our dear Miss Kilman, he asked. They are upstairs. I think they are praying, said she. And he didn't say I love you, but he held her hand. Happiness is this, he thought. Must I invite all the dull women in London to my parties, she said. She was angry with Mrs. Marsham's letter. Did she wish she had married Peter years ago? Richard thought, and he said he must go to work. But he stood. He was going to say something. But what? Why? There were the flowers. He left home for work. Clarissa cared much more for her flowers than for politics. She was not interested in Richard's business. She suddenly felt very much unhappy. But why? Was it because of Miss Doris Kilman and Elizabeth? No. Can it be something Peter or Richard said today? No, it cannot be. There were his roses, her parties. That was it. Her parties. Both Richard and Peter laughed at her for her parties. That was it. Now she felt perfectly happy. Peter had always said her parties had been only for show, and Richard thought them nonsense and childish. They are quite wrong, she said to herself. What she liked only was life itself. My parties are for life. And Peter, is Peter always in love with the wrong woman? What's your love? She might say to him, and she knew his answer. How is it the most important thing in the world, and no woman possibly understands it? Very well. But could any other man understand what she meant either? About life? She could not imagine Peter or Richard taking the trouble to give a party for no reason whatsoever. No man understands the meaning of her parties. It was an offering, to bring people together. It was her gift. She didn't have any special importance. She could not think, write, even play the piano. She didn't know about geography or history. All the same, that one day should follow another, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, Saturday, that one should wake up in the morning, see the sky, walk in the park, meet Hugh Whitbread, then suddenly in came Peter. Then these roses, it was enough. After that, how unbelievable death was, that it must end, and no one in the world would know how she had loved it all of life. The door opened. Elizabeth came in very quietly. She stood still and looked at her mother. Miss Kilman was outside the door. Clarissa knew. She was listening to them. Clarissa didn't like her coat. but Miss Kilman had her reasons. First, it was cheap, and second, she was over 40 and didn't dress to make others like. She was poor, moreover. Mr. Dalloway was always kind to her, but she thought Mrs. Dalloway was not. Miss Kilman was from the lower class. Dalloways had expensive things everywhere, pictures, carpets, lots of servants. She thought they should do something for her. Life was not fair to her. A girl has the right to some kind of happiness, and I have never been happy, she thought. She was educated on history, and she tried to learn new things as much as she could. She found a job as a teacher at a school. But when the war started, she lost her job. All of these kinds of bitter feelings had brought Miss Kilman into a church 2 years ago. She heard prayers there and saw the light. She cried painfully. It was the hand of God, the priest said. God had shown her the way. So now, whenever the bitter and painful feelings of hate came to her, she thought of God. Then she became calm and felt better. Mr. Dalloway allowed her to teach his daughter. God helped her, and she saw the light 2 years ago. Now she was not jealous of women like Clarissa Dalloway. She felt sorry for them. She hated them. With all of these luxuries, how could things be any better? Staying at home or giving parties? Mrs. Dalloway and other fine ladies must be in a factory. Mrs. Dalloway came out of the room with her daughter. Elizabeth said she had forgotten her gloves, and she ran upstairs to take them, because she knew Miss Kilman and her mother hated each other, and she couldn't stand to see them together. But Miss Kilman did not hate Mrs. Dalloway. She looked at her small pink face, her nice body, her air of freshness and fashion. She felt Mrs. Dalloway was silly and simple. She felt a great power in herself to press Mrs. Dalloway. How she wanted to make her cry and upset, very upset. It was not the body, it was the soul. But this was God's will, not Miss Kilman's. So she felt superior to Clarissa. Clarissa was really shocked. This is a Christian. This woman had taken her daughter from her. Heavy, ugly, simple, and with no kindness. They stood there and spoke little. Miss Kilman worked and earned her living. But this Mrs. Dalloway did nothing, believed nothing. Elizabeth came at that moment. So they were going to the shops. Miss Kilman stood there in her terrible coat, like a monster. But then this monster became smaller and lost her power and turned into Miss Kilman again. Clarissa laughed at this monster. She said goodbye. Miss Kilman and Elizabeth went downstairs together. Love and religion, Clarissa thought. How hateful they are. Miss Kilman was not here. It was not the body, not the person. It was the idea. She had never wanted to change people. She always wished everybody to be themselves, and she watched out of the window the old lady, her opposite neighbor. She was climbing upstairs. Clarissa thought that old lady was free to do whatever she wanted. She climbs upstairs if she wants, or she stops, Clarissa thought. She respected that lady. She was alone and free. But love and religion would destroy that. Miss Kilman would destroy it, yet it made her want to cry. Chapter 8. Fear no more, Septimus. Love destroyed, Mrs. Dalloway thought. Everything that was fine, everything that was true went. Take Peter Walsh now. He was a clever, handsome man with ideas about everything. Peter knew better than anyone. Peter had helped and given her books. But then he loved a simple woman. Think of Peter in love. He came to see her after all these years, and what did he talk about? Himself. Love destroyed Peter, she thought. It was strange to see the old lady move away from the window. Clarissa watched her as she moved about from one room to another. Clarissa tried to follow her as she turned and disappeared. She was still there, moving about at the other end of the room. Clarissa could still see her. Peter and Miss Kilman might say they solved it, but Clarissa didn't believe them. Here was another room, there another. Did religion or love solve the problem of loneliness? Clarissa Dalloway had laughed at me, thought Miss Doris Kilman. She and Elizabeth were going to the shops. She couldn't look or talk like Mrs. Dalloway, but could she be like her? No, Mrs. Dalloway was not good, not clever, not serious. She wanted to cry when Clarissa laughed at her. She was not beautiful. She couldn't buy pretty clothes. Yet Clarissa had laughed. She thought of God and prayed. She felt no one could love her. She just lived to eat or drink. Sometimes it had seemed to her that her food was all she lived for, her comforts, her dinner, her tea. But one must fight, have faith in God. But why should she be unhappy while other women, like Clarissa, had everything? They entered a shop and bought some things. They must have their tea, said Miss Kilman. As they were drinking at the table, it seemed to Elizabeth that eating was the only happiness for Miss Kilman. She was very different from anyone Elizabeth knew. She was clever and educated, but she looked plain, very plain. Elizabeth had never thought about the poor. They lived with everything they wanted, but Miss Kilman said one morning, "My grandfather kept an oil and color shop in Kensington." She made one feel so small. Elizabeth looked for her gloves, her white gloves. They were under the table. Elizabeth couldn't stand her eating, and she felt she must go. But Miss Kilman wouldn't let her go. This youth, this beauty wouldn't go away from her. "Are you going to the party tonight?" Miss Kilman said. Clarissa wanted her daughter to go, but Elizabeth didn't like parties much. "I never go to parties," said Miss Kilman. She felt so unhappy. "Why should they ask me? I am plain. I am unhappy," she said. However, she was Doris Kilman. She was educated, and she had made her way in the world. Her knowledge was respectable. "I don't feel sorry for myself," she said. "I feel sorry for other people much more." But she wanted to say, "for your mother." Of course she didn't. She could not say it to Elizabeth. She wanted to keep Elizabeth in her hand, to have Elizabeth for herself, to see Elizabeth turning against her mother. She wanted to have Elizabeth's sympathy. Elizabeth felt she must go. She didn't want to listen to her any more. She stood up, then went away. "Mrs. Dalloway has won," thought Doris Kilman, for Elizabeth had gone. That beauty, that youth had gone away from her. She left the shop and entered a church. She tried to get rid of both hate and love. She prayed and prayed to God. Elizabeth waited for the bus in Victoria Street. It was so nice to be out of doors. Everybody was looking at her nowadays. They were comparing her to flowers. She was a young, beautiful girl, and she had to go to the parties. Her beautiful eyes and nice body would make every man fall in love with her. But it was really boring for her. She didn't care about her clothes, or beauty or men. She just wanted to be alone with her father and dogs. As she got on the bus, she felt herself like a child. It was a nice dream to be a child again. Miss Kilman loved her, she knew this, but there was something wrong about her. Miss Kilman was always talking about her own unhappiness, and it made her so difficult. And did Elizabeth give one thought to poor Miss Kilman? She was happy to be free. The fresh air was so delicious. Miss Kilman often said to her, "You can be a doctor or a farmer. Women can do any job now." And Elizabeth liked the feeling of people working. Unlike her mother, she would like to have a job. Whatever her mother might say, to become a farmer or a doctor was a nice dream. But she was, of course, too lazy, and it was much better to say nothing about it. It seemed so silly. But now she must go home. She must dress for dinner. Septimus Warren Smith was sitting on the sofa in the sitting room. He was calm. He was dreaming again and thinking of death. "Fear no more," says the heart and the body. "Fear no more." He was not afraid any more. Lucrezia was sitting at the table and making a hat. She watched him. He was smiling. He was happy then. But she couldn't watch him smiling any more. It was not marriage. It was not one's husband to look strange like that. He was always strange, laughing and sitting silent for hours, then crying out, talking about war, Shakespeare. He made her write meaningless things. He was excited without any reason one day, and was very calm another day. He said his dead friend Evans had come. He tried to listen to him. Lucrezia could hear nothing, of course. He said he knew everything. There was no death. He used to say that he couldn't breathe in the water, or that he was hearing music. "But lovely," he used to say. Then he started to cry. This was the worst thing for Lucrezia, seeing a man like Septimus crying. Now Lucrezia put down her scissors. She turned to take something from the table. Septimus was watching her. She was making a hat for Mrs. Filmer's married daughter. Her name was... He had forgotten her name. "What is the name of Mrs. Filmer's daughter?" he asked. "Mrs. Peters," said Lucrezia. "What does she do?" asked Septimus. Lucrezia tried to remember. He watched her talking. Her face was perfectly natural. Perhaps for the first time he saw real things in the room. He looked at the gramophone, the sideboards, the pictures on the walls. None of these things moved. All were real. It was exciting for him. "It is too small for Mrs. Peters," he said. He was speaking as he used to speak in the past. He took it out of her hands. He said it was like a monkey's hat. How funny! They laughed together. She had never felt so happy, never in her life. He opened her workbox. He took out ribbons and started to put different colors together. He had a wonderful eye, and he was often right about colors. "She shall have a beautiful hat," he said. It was finished now, and Lucrezia should be careful with it. He gave it to her. So Lucrezia sewed the hat. "There it is," said she, showing Mrs. Peters' hat. It was wonderful. It was so real, Mrs. Peters' hat. Septimus felt proud of it. "Just look at it," he said. Yes, it would always make her happy to see that hat. He had become himself then. He had laughed then. They had been alone together. She would always like that hat. They read the newspaper together. Then he was very tired. He was very happy. He would sleep. He shut his eyes. He saw nothing but heard sounds like the cries of people. They couldn't find him. They had lost him. He woke up in fear. What did he see? He looked around. Nobody was there. That was it. To be alone forever. He was alone. The faces, the voices of the dead, where were they? "Evans!" he cried. There was no answer. "We are perfectly happy now," she said suddenly. She felt she could say whatever came into her head. That was the first thing she had felt about him. They had first met in a cafe. She could remember that she would tell him anything, and he understood at once. Her own family even were not the same. He could help her, and she too could help him. She put the hat on her head and waited for him to say he liked it or not. Looking at her, he could feel her mind. But he remembered. Dr. Bradshaw said, "When we are ill, the people we loved are not good for us." Bradshaw said he must learn to rest. He and Lucrezia must be separated. Must? 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 Why must? How could that Bradshaw say such a thing? "It is because you talked of killing yourself," said Lucrezia. So he was in their power. Holmes and Bradshaw were on him. Where were his papers? The things he had written? She brought him his papers, the things he had written, things she had written for him. They looked at them together. "Burn them," he cried. But Lucrezia took them and thought some were very beautiful. She said she would tie them up so nobody could see. She would put them away. And she said even if they took him, she would go with him. She sat next to him and said, "Nobody can separate us." She heard some voices downstairs and thought it was Dr. Holmes. She ran down to prevent him from coming up. Septimus could hear her talking to Holmes. "My dear lady, I have come as a friend," Holmes was saying. "No, I will not allow you to see my husband," she said. She couldn't stop him. He was coming upstairs. Holmes would come and take him. But no, not Holmes, not Bradshaw. Septimus looked at the knife, then thought of gas fire. But it was too late now. Holmes was coming. There was only the window. People, like Holmes and Bradshaw, liked this kind of tragedy. He went to the window, but he would wait until the very last moment. He didn't want to die. Life was good. The sun hot. Only people. Holmes was at the door. "I will give it to you," cried Septimus, and jumped out of the window. They ran to the window. Lucrezia saw. She understood. And why did he do it? Dr. Holmes couldn't understand. The doctor gave her something to drink, something to keep her calm. Now after she drank it, all the things she remembered were happy things. She felt she was going somewhere. "He's dead," she said. She was falling asleep, and they were carrying Septimus away now. Chapter 9. Peter is coming to Clarissa's party. "I don't know whether to laugh or cry," thought Peter Walsh. He couldn't get the right time. Why, God knows, that visit to Clarissa, how he cried in front of her. Peter stopped to watch the ambulance carrying away Septimus's dead body. This ambulance, and life and death. He thought of life like an unknown garden, full of surprises. Yes, it really took one's breath away. In these moments things came together. Life and death came together. Clarissa had always said she had felt herself everywhere, not only here or there, but everywhere. Peter thought it was because of her fear of death. She was so afraid of death that she believed there would stay something after we died. The unseen part of us could be found in some place after death. Perhaps. Perhaps. For all those long years, their meetings have been short and painful. Whenever he and Clarissa came together, those moments were always uncomfortable. But there was something strange about it. Seeing Clarissa always touched him deeply. It gave him a sense of feeling and understanding. He got the meaning then. She influenced him more than any person he had ever known. Now he reached his hotel and the young lady gave him some letters. He went upstairs and he remembered the old days at Burton. He saw Clarissa most often there, in the late summer, when he stayed there for a week. They walked always. She was bored of driving, disliked all animals except that dog. All the time they argued, discussed poetry, discussed people, discussed politics. And yes, it was a letter from her, from Clarissa. That blue envelope, that was her hand. It was another of those uncomfortable meetings. He thought and opened the letter. How nice it was to see him. She must tell him that. That was all. But it upset him. It annoyed him. After all, she had married Dalloway and lived with him in perfect happiness all these years. He put the paper away. He didn't want to read it again. He thought how and why she wrote it. Perhaps she was upset by his visit, and she felt something when she kissed his hand. Perhaps she was jealous. Perhaps she remembered something he had said. How they would change the world if she married him. But it was this. It was middle age after all these years. Why did women like him? His gray hair or looks? There was something unusual about him, or something behind him. Perhaps because he was a gentleman. He thought of Daisy. She was only 24 and had 2 small children, yet she would give him everything. If they married, it would be all very well for him. But what about her? She was a widow with 2 children, and the society was there. Perhaps it would be better if she forgot him. Perhaps he should not marry her. He went down to dinner. He watched ladies and gentlemen around them. He talked with a few people in the smoking room, and he felt they liked him. He would go to Clarissa's party. Yes, he wanted to go and ask Richard what they were doing in India. What did the government mean? Richard Dalloway would know. To do about India. He sat outside the hotel and watched the city change. People were going somewhere for the evening. Here he was, as young as ever, but still he was jealous of young people, of their youth. How London has changed since he went to India. The women were freer now. As he was walking to the Dalloway's house, he enjoyed the excitement in the city, and there it was, cars and people going to Clarissa's party. Chapter 10. Life and Death at Her Party. Lucy came running after she had prepared the drawing room, the table, the chairs, the flowers. Whoever came in must think how clean, how beautiful, how rich. The voices. People were already coming up from dinner. She must fly. The Prime Minister was coming, Agnes said. She had heard them say in the dining room. She was carrying glasses. Did it matter? Did it matter in the least, one Prime Minister more or less? The ladies were going upstairs already, said Lucy. The ladies were going up, one by one. Mrs. Dalloway was walking here and there and sending messages about the food to the kitchen. They were laughing. The gentlemen were enjoying themselves when the ladies had gone. Lucy talked about how Miss Elizabeth looked lovely in her pink dress. She couldn't take her eyes off of her. Jenny must remember the dog, Miss Elizabeth's dog. It might want something, Elizabeth thought. But Jenny was not going upstairs with all those people about. There was a car at the door already. There was a ring at the bell, and the gentlemen were still in the dining room drinking. There, they were going upstairs, one by one, now faster and faster. Mr. Wilkins was announcing the guests at the door. Lady and Miss Lovejoy, Sir John and Lady Needham, Miss Weld, Mr. Walsh. "How delightful to see you," said Clarissa. She said it to everyone. "How delightful to see you." Peter Walsh didn't like her way of speaking. She was so insincere. She didn't speak from the heart, he thought. It was a great mistake to have come, for he knew no one. Oh dear, it was going to be a failure, a big failure, Clarissa felt. She could see Peter standing there, in that corner. He was criticizing her, she was sure. Why, after all, did she do these things? Why did he come, then, only to criticize? She must speak to him, but she would not get the chance. All the windows were open, and Ellie Anderson thought that the young girls would get cold. It was not for herself. She was wearing a shawl over her old black dress, but the young girls' shoulders were naked. They would be ill. She was not happy about the party, for she felt Clarissa didn't want to invite her, in fact. Why should she? There was no reason, really, except that they had always known each other. They were cousins. It was an event to her, going to a party. She was over 50 and didn't have money to buy new clothes. But wasn't that Elizabeth grown up with her fashionable hair and the pink dress? She couldn't be more than 17. She was very, very beautiful. But in the old days, girls used to wear white, not pink, Ellie thought. She was standing and watching people. She felt they were interesting, politicians mostly, Richard Dalloway's friends. "Hello, Richard," said somebody. There was old Peter Walsh. He was delighted to see him. He hadn't changed a bit. They went together, walking right across the room, touching each other's arm kindly. So it was not a failure after all. It was going to be all right now, her party. It had started. Colonel and Mrs. Garrett, Mr. Hugh Whitbread, Mr. Bowley, Mrs. Hilberry, Mr. Quinn. Clarissa had 6 or 7 words with each, and they went on. They went into the rooms, into something now. And yet for her own part, Clarissa worked much on this party. She felt she made this happen. She forgot what she looked like, but felt herself having a different role. Every time she gave a party, she had this feeling of being something, not herself, and that everyone was unreal in a way. Everyone was much more real in another. It was possible to say things you couldn't say anywhere else, possible to go much deeper, feel much deeper, but not yet for her, not yet. And here was Lady Bruton. "How good of you to come," Clarissa said. "What name, Lady Rossiter? Who was she?" "Clarissa, that voice! It was Sally Seton. Sally Seton! After all these years she had changed much. To think of her under this roof, in this room, but not like that. It was strange to see her again, older, happier, less lovely. They kissed each other, and Clarissa turned, with Sally's hand in hers. "I have 5 sons," said Sally. She used to talk about herself first always, and Clarissa loved her for being still like that. "I can't believe it," she cried. But Mr. Wilkins announced, "The Prime Minister!" The Prime Minister? Was it really? He looked so simple. Clarissa and Richard met him. It was funny to watch. Nobody looked at him. They just went on talking. Yet they perfectly knew that he was the symbol of English society. The Prime Minister was there. Hugh Whitbread and Lady Bruton were now with the Prime Minister, talking about something. There was something sweet about Clarissa, Peter thought. She had lost her coldness, so she made him think. But he was not in love. Clarissa felt people would be jealous of her, perhaps because of the Prime Minister's coming to her party. Yes, it was a success, but she felt how empty it was. She wasn't happy now as she used to be in the past. It didn't give deep emotions at all. She talked with her friends. They all liked her, respected her, yet they were dull and mindless. "Richard so much enjoyed his lunch party," said Clarissa to Lady Bruton. "He helped me to write a letter. And how are you?" Lady Bruton said. "Oh, perfectly well," said Clarissa. Lady Bruton always thought Clarissa should help Richard more in his work. She liked Clarissa, but felt they had not much to talk about. Clarissa moved among her guests and said to Sally and Peter, "I shall come later, wait. I shall come back," she said, looking at her old friends. Sally was laughing, but her voice was not as it used to be in old days. How she had married a rich man and had 5 sons. She was not Sally, Clarissa knew. Sally and Peter sat down together. They were talking, perhaps about the past. Clarissa had lived her past with them. A part of this Sally always had to be. Peter always had to be, but she had to leave them now, because the Bradshaws were here. Clarissa didn't like him. "We are so late, dear Mrs. Dalloway," said Lady Bradshaw. Clarissa looked at Sir William Bradshaw, talking to Richard. There had always been something strange about Bradshaw. She didn't like him. Sir William Bradshaw was telling Richard something, about a young man who killed himself today. Lady Bradshaw said, "A very sad thing it was. A young man had killed himself. He had been in the army." "Oh," thought Clarissa, "in the middle of my party, here is death." A young man had killed himself, and they talked of it at her party. The Bradshaws talked of death. He had killed himself. But how? He had jumped out of a window. But why had he done it? And the Bradshaws talked of it at her party. They went on living. They would grow old. But this young man killed himself. If it were now to die, it were now to be most happy, Clarissa had said to herself once. There was in the depths of her heart an awful fear. Was it a message? Did the young man want to say something when he killed himself? Clarissa felt this young man was not very different from other people, from herself. She had to be here in her evening dress, but that young man had killed himself. She had never been so happy. She walked to the window. She looked. Oh, but how surprising! In the room opposite, the old lady was going to bed. It was delightful to watch her. That old woman was moving about the room, coming to the window. Could she see her? It was exciting. People were still laughing in the drawing-room, and yet she was watching that old woman going to bed alone. That old woman, free and alone. The clock began striking. The young man had killed himself, but she didn't feel sorry for him. The old lady put out her light. Her house was dark now, and Clarissa said to herself, "Fear no more the heat of the sun." She must go back to her party. But what a strange night! She felt somehow very like him, the young man who had killed himself. She felt happy that he had done it, killed himself while they went on living. The clock was striking, but she must go back. She must find Sally and Peter, and she came in from the little room. For a very, very short time, she felt deep and real. Chapter 11. The party is over. Clarissa is there. "But where is Clarissa?" said Peter. He was sitting on the sofa with Sally. After all these years, he really could not call her Lady Rossiter. Both Sally and Peter thought Clarissa had to be nice to her important guests. There were politicians, of course. She was with them. "I have 5 sons," Sally told Peter. God, what a change had come over her, he thought. The softness of motherhood. Peter remembered the last time they met. That was his old habit, this pocket knife, Sally thought. He always played with it when he got excited. They had been very good friends, very close, when he was in love with Clarissa. How Sally had called Richard Wickham, and how it had annoyed Clarissa. Sally and Clarissa hadn't seen each other much after that horrible night, and Peter Walsh had gone off to India, and she had heard that he had made an unhappy marriage. But she didn't know if he had any children, and she couldn't ask him, because he had changed. Sally felt very close to him, for he was a part of her youth, and she still had the book he had given her. Was he writing still? In those days he used to write. "Have you written?" she asked him. "Not a word," said Peter Walsh, and she laughed. She was still attractive, Sally Seton, but who was this Rossiter? Peter didn't know much about Sally's husband, but he was a rich man. "You would like him if you met," she said. Her husband did everything for her. Elizabeth was standing over there, and Peter thought, she was not a bit like Clarissa when he saw her. "Oh, Clarissa," said Sally. Her feelings were strong for Clarissa. They had been friends, very good friends. But Clarissa didn't have something. Did Peter understand what it was? What did she lack? How had she done it, thought Sally. How had she married Richard Dalloway? She had never understood why. "Is it Hugh Whitbread?" said Sally. Yes, it was Hugh, the perfect Hugh. But did he have any children? "Everybody in the room has 6 sons, Peter told her. "Except me. Thank God he had no sons, no daughters, no wife." "Well, he didn't seem sorry about this," said Sally. "He looked younger than any of them. But it had been a mistake," Peter said, "to marry that silly woman. Yet we had a good time." How could that be? Sally thought. What did he mean? And how strange it was to know him, and yet not know a single thing about his life in India. It must be lonely at his age to have no home, nowhere to go. Where was Clarissa all this time? It was getting late. "Tell me, who is this?" asked Sally. It was Mrs. Hilberry, looking for the door, for how late it was getting. "Old Mrs. Hilberry," said Peter. But who was that? That lady standing by the window all the evening without speaking? "Oh, that is Ellie Henderson," said Sally. Clarissa was really very hard on her. She was a cousin, very poor. Clarissa was hard on people. She was rather, said Peter. Yet how generous to her friends Clarissa was. She put the friendship first. They were young, that was it. Peter would think her emotional. Yes, she was emotional, because she had thought that it was the only thing worth saying, what one felt. It was not the mind, it was only the heart. One must say what one felt. "But I do not know," said Peter Walsh, "what I feel." Poor Peter, thought Sally. Why did not Clarissa come and talk to them? Peter wanted that, she knew it. All the time he was thinking only of Clarissa, and was playing with his knife. He had not found life easy, Peter said. His relations with Clarissa had not been simple. It had turned his life upside down, he said. It had destroyed my life, Peter said. One could not be in love twice. And what could she say? Clarissa had cared for him more than she had ever cared for Richard, Sally said. She was sure. No, 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 said Peter. Sally shouldn't say this. That good man, there he was at the end of the room, dear old Richard. Who was he talking to? Sally asked, but Peter didn't know. Were they happy together? She knew nothing about them. One cannot know of the people, even though one lives with them every day, she thought. When she felt tired of human relationships, because people were so difficult, she often went into her garden and found peace among her flowers. Men or women never gave her such peace. But no, Peter didn't like plants, he preferred human beings. The young are beautiful, Sally said. As Peter was watching Elizabeth cross the room, he thought that Elizabeth was unlike Clarissa at her age. Could he make her speak? She wouldn't open her lips. Not yet, Peter thought. But Peter didn't agree that we know nothing. We know everything, he said. At least he knew. When one was young, said Peter, one was too much excited to know people. But when one was old then, said he, one could watch, one could understand, and one didn't lose power of feeling. Sally felt more deeply and excited every year. She was 55 in body, she said, but her heart was like a girl of 20. There was someone in India. He would like to tell Sally about her. He would like Sally to know her. She was married, he said. She had 2 small children. They must all come to her house in Manchester, said Sally. There is Elizabeth, Peter said. She feels not half what we feel, not yet. Sally was watching Elizabeth go to her father when she said, "But one can see they love each other very much." She could feel it by the way Elizabeth went to her father. Richard thought to himself, "Who is that lovely girl?" And suddenly he saw that it was Elizabeth. She looked so lovely in her pink dress, and it was his dear daughter. The party was almost finished. Richard and his daughter were looking at the people going, and the rooms were getting emptier and emptier. Richard and Elizabeth were pleased it was finished, but Richard was proud of his daughter. "I shall go and talk to Richard. I shall say good night. The heart always comes first," said Sally. She stood up. "And I will come," said Peter. But he didn't move for a moment. What is this strong feeling? What is this great happiness? He thought to himself. What makes me so excited? He saw Clarissa at the door. "It is Clarissa," he said. She came into the room. There she was.